Monetary policy obviously has to deal with the two things, which is money supply and the interest rate, right? इसी पॉलिसी को आप एक्सपेंशनरी भी कर सकते हो और कॉन्ट्रैक्शनरी भी कर सकते हो. So if I want to go for an expansionary, that means I'm going for a stance of growing the economy. And remember, monetary policy, AS में हमने बताया था, this is like a demand side policy, right? It's a demand side. It's a demand side policy. So expansionary में, you will go for an increase in money supply and you're going to go for a reduction in monetary policy, in interest rates. Usually जब हम डायग्राम बनाते हैं तो मनी सप्लाई इंक्रीज होने से इंटरेस्ट रेट वैसे ही नीचे चला जाता है. So they sort of like work together. और इसकी वजह से aggregate demand बढ़ता है and whatever you are looking for in the economy, that sort of like happens. Then you have the contractionary policy. This is like a contractionary stance, which works the opposite ways. You should know this by heart. Honestly, और इसमें तुम गड़बड़ नहीं कर सकते. Now you're too old for it. You've done this stuff too many times. If you still don't know monetary policy में क्या दो चीजें आती हैं और expansionary, contractionary, you are in trouble. You need to sort that problem out. Or consciously actually make effort to learn it. अब बात ये होती है कि through these policies, you try to achieve certain goals. Now, monetary policy की जब बात होती है, तो remember, I mentioned this quite a few times. You have to talk about the problems, different school of thoughts. Monetary policy, Keynesians को नहीं पसंद. Keynesians like government intervention, but they prefer the government spending and taxes. On the other hand, the monetarists prefer monetary policy. They say अगर intervention करनी ही है, तो you should go for monetary policy. That's better. Fiscal policy, not so good. There are issues with it. We'll discuss that when we do fiscal policy. But for now, we'll talk about this. अब monetary policy के अंदर monetarists कहते हैं कि you can have an effect on these money supply and interest rate to achieve your macroeconomic objectives. You should know your 5 macroeconomic objectives, starting with the most basic one, stable price levels, yani stable inflation. You don't want a reduction in inflation, please. If they give you an option and they say, हाँ जी, macroeconomic objective के अंदर low inflation is the objective, no. You want to have low and stable inflation. So if they're saying reduce inflation is an objective, reducing inflation is not an objective, it really depends. कि अगर तुम्हारा inflation rate already 2% के ऊपर है, making it even further down is not good for economy. We said 2-3% is not bad inflation, it's good inflation. Consumers don't mind paying 2-3% yearly, and producers love 2-3% extra yearly. It actually encourages the economy. Double-digit, galloping hyperinflation, that's bad. Both for consumer, producers, and government understands that. So, galloping inflation ho ya hyperinflation ho, to haan, reduction in inflation can be government's objective. But for that, your inflation rate should be on the higher side. I hope you understand that. So macroeconomic objective ke andar, our first objective is you want low and stable inflation. Deflation is not good also if your economy is already suffering from low inflation and low economic activity. Number 2 we give is to economic growth चाहिए. हाँ जी, economic growth चाहिए, पर कितना economic growth चाहिए? Sustainable economic growth चाहिए. बहुत सारा नहीं, बहुत कम नहीं, जो भी हो long lasting हो, ज़्यादा time के लिए चले. So whatever that percentage might be, sustainable. फिर उसके बाद we say low unemployment होनी चाहिए या फिर full employment होनी चाहिए. So if this is something like एक दफा MCQ आया उसमें उन्होंने बोला, I think O level का MCQ था, उन्होंने कहा गवर्नमेंट के ऑब्जेक्टिव्स के अंदर क्या चीज है सही. दो तो बिल्कुल ही गलत थे, दो थोड़े से कंफ्यूजिंग थे. One was you want to increase employment or decrease inflation. Okay, yeah, decrease prices. What is the government objective? You want to increase employment or you want to decrease prices? So the answer was that you want to increase employment, but not decrease in prices, because maybe the prices were already too low. That would display negative for you. But increased employment is definitely good until you reach the full employment levels. फिर उसके बाद ये तो तीन तुम्हारे टॉप प्रायोरिटी हो गए. फिर थोड़ा इंटरनेशनल चले जाते हैं. Stable balance of payment and forex, foreign exchange. That's also good, because if you have a stable BOP, you will have a stable balance of exchange rate. And lastly, it's about you want an equitable distribution of income. Equitable, okay? Equitable means that you want fair. Equitable हरगिज ये मतलब नहीं है that everyone should get paid equally. We're not discussing a communist idea over here. We're talking about fairness, justice. For example, I might have asked this question before even, but let me go over it again. If I say there are two managers and they both are, let's say, junior managers, same position, and they both, should they be getting paid equally for the work and the responsibility that they have? Should they be paid equally? Now, a lot of times, what we have heard is them saying, agar khas taur pe, if you want to make it interesting, you can bring gender into discussion, and then, you know, it can really, the flames can go high, but we don't care about that. Let's talk about do bande hain, same race ke hain, no gender issue, and then they both are managers, same position, same responsibility. Should they be getting paid equally? A lot of people say yes, they should, but we're saying no, not necessarily. What if one is more hardworking than the other? What if one is putting in more hours than the other? What if one is more qualified than the other and brings in more revenue for the business? Then should you be paying them equally? The answer is no. But should the other person know why the other one is getting more? I think that's a fair idea. ठीक है, आप उसको बताओ कि this guy is getting paid more than you because of blah 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 reason, because he's working more, so that the other person now knows कि हाँ जी benchmark किधर है. But unfortunately in our economies, हम लोग ये जो contract sign करते हैं that we cannot disclose our wage with our colleagues, ये बहुत पुराने ज़माने से चलते हुए आ रहा है. And one of the reason is to give strength to the corporations so that they can exploit workers however they want. तो अभी उस पे भी debate चल रही है काफी सालों से कि it should not be there in the clause because it's not fair. अगर किसी बंदे को ज़्यादा मिल रहे हैं तो you should tell the other person why he's getting. But again they say कि बहुत लंबी discussion हो जाएगी and corporate and shareholders और इन सब की profitability hurt हो सकती है and all of that. But that's a different thing. But I hope you understand what I mean by the fairness. We don't want equality in output, yeah, outcomes basically they say. We don't want equity in output. कि हर किसी को equal मिलना चाहिए. There should be quota system with men and women. Same number of seats should be for engineering in men and same number of seats should be reserved for the women. Same goes for the nursing. Same number for men, same number for women. But you don't want to create that outcome के अंदर equality. Opportunity के अंदर definitely you should have equality, that anyone could apply for a position and anyone should be able to get it if they're valued for it and if they have the qualification for it, whether it's male, female, or different races, they should have the opportunity to get the position, but the result of their incomes and stuff, उसके ऊपर कोई guarantee, outcome के ऊपर कोई guarantee नहीं होनी चाहिए. So please make sure that you understand what this redistribution of income is. फिर ये discussion ज़्यादातर जाता है in terms of जो हमने वो curves भी किए हैं. I think it was the Lorenz curve, the Gini coefficient that we spoke about. So do take a look at that. That's an important one that explains inequality. We've had a discussion on that. Quite a big discussion, in fact. So उसके अंदर it's about कितना middle income we should have. National income के अंदर साथ we have जो redistribution के अंदर जो हमारे पास inequality वाला था, that was about किस तरह से कितनी percentage of population के पास कितनी percentage of wealth है, percentage of wealth, और उसमें एक equity की line बनती थी, और फिर जो countries जितना ज़्यादा दूर होती थी उस equity line से, we said उतनी ज़्यादा inequality है. The closer you are to this equity line, the more equitable the countries would be. So for example, let's say Singapore is very closer to the equity line and Pakistan or African countries can be very far away from it. I think we've done this. I remember doing this. Or इसके अंदर, in fact, I also went and had we had our discussion on while we were doing this. ये उस वक्त बात हुई थी जब हमने living standards को measure करने के लिए we spoke about HDI, MEW और उसी के साथ पे I think the lecture is uploaded also. वो जो नया link मैंने भेजा है ना उसके अंदर जो मेरे board वाले lectures हैं उसके अंदर there is discussion on it. So you can check that link. You will find it. Notes में भी देखोगे तो मिल जाएगा. Normal lectures में भी देखोगे तो मिल जाएगा. It's with the living standards measurement. Anyhow, so yeah. So the point is, monetary policy can help you achieve these. और इसका इन तीन के लिए तो at least we have very good model which is our demand supply का model. बहुत अच्छा मॉडल है जो एग्रीगेट डिमांड और एग्रीगेट सप्लाई को कम करके प्राइस लेवल्स, जैसे होता है ना हमारा वाई एक्सिस पे प्राइस है और यहाँ पे रियल आउटपुट है, तो इफ एग्रीगेट डिमांड इंक्रीजेस वी कैन से हाउ द प्राइस हैज गॉन अप एंड इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ हैज इंक्रीज्ड एंड अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट हैज फॉलन. तो ये तीन तो यहाँ पे बहुत अच्छा डिस्कस हो जाता है इन आवर डायग्राम्स, एडीएएस के डायग्राम्स के अंदर. सो वी कैन एक्सप्लेन इट very nicely. जहां तक money supply की बात है, how you can change money supply, we said there are ways to change the money supply and interest rates. Ways like open market operations. You know how central bank can go and buy financial assets from banks and businesses, और जब भी वो bonds की buying and selling करते हैं उससे वो money supply effect कर सकते हैं. Please make sure that you understand this part. Case study के अंदर आ चुका है इस किस्म का question कि open market operations के अंदर अगर central bank bonds sell कर रहे हैं to the corporates and buying financial assets from them, तो उसकी वजह से what will happen to the money supply? So central bank गया financial institutions के पास, उनसे बोला ये लो bonds, ठीक है, and give me your money. Financial institutions के पास पैसे कम हो गए, तो ये तुम्हारा एक तरीका है मनी सप्लाई में इकोनॉमी में कम करने. तुमने जाके जो है फाइनेंशियल एसेट्स बेच दिए उनको और उनसे मनी ले लिया. या फिर तुम ये भी कर सकते हो कि उनसे जाके फाइनेंशियल एसेट्स बाय कर लिए, तो फाइनेंशियल एसेट्स अब तुम्हारे पास आ गए एज सेंट्रल बैंक, और तुमने उनको मनी सप्लाई दे दिया. नाउ दे हैव लिक्विडिटी, they can flood the market with the money supply. It's there in your notes, page 108 in the chapter book. और monetary policy के अंदर I think it's like page 2 only. फिर monetary policy पढ़ रहे होगे. एक तरीका तो ये है. Then there are more ways also. Like सीधे सीधे जाके cash ratio change कर दो. Cash ratio, liquidity ratio, reserve ratio, these were all those things कि क्या सेंट्रल बैंक जो कमर्शियल बैंक्स को बोलता है आपने कितना कैश होल्ड रखना है, बाकी आप दे सकते हो, आगे लोन आउट कर सकते हो. जो फ्रैक्शनल बैंक रिजर्व, फ्रैक्शनल बैंकिंग सिस्टम में होता है. अगर मैं अपना कैश रेशियो बढ़ा दूं तो दैट मींस बैंक्स हैव टू कीप मोर कैश इन हैंड एंड दे कैन लोन आउट लेस मनी. लेस क्रेडिट विल बी अवेलेबल, money supply is going to go down. लेकिन अगर cash ratio कम कर दो तो banks will be able to loan out more of the deposits and that will increase the money supply का जो वो money multiplier effect होता है. उसके अलावा banks can definitely affect the interest rate and the discount rates. Discount rates अलग होता है, interest rate अलग होता है. डिस्काउंट रेट बेसिकली होता है जो सेंट्रल बैंक और कमर्शियल बैंक्स या इंटर बैंक रेट होता है. इफ द बैंक वांट्स टू बोरो मनी, इफ द बैंक्स, फैसल बैंक और इनको अगर पैसे की जरूरत है because they've loaned out too much and now people need money and they're coming for their deposits, so they can borrow from other banks or through the central bank. उसको हम बोलते हैं डिस्काउंट रेट. Pakistan में you can call it KIBOR, Karachi Interbank Offering Rate. In London it's called LIBOR, London Interbank Offering Rate. ये central bank और commercial banks के बीच में होता है. They can even affect the interest rate. Interest rate basically commercial banks और public के बीच में होता है. Public meaning firms, businesses, क्योंकि हम तो जाके सेंट्रल बैंक से डील नहीं कर सकते. पब्लिक कैन डील विद कमर्शियल बैंक, और कमर्शियल बैंक्स जो है वो तुमको बोलते हैं काइबोर +2 के ऊपर काम होगा. दैट मींस जो डिस्काउंट रेट है प्लस उस पे 2% हम रखेंगे. तो या आई विल एक्सप्लेन डिस्काउंट वन मोर टाइम. The thing is, commercial banks have to keep liquidity and earn profitability. Liquidity मतलब लोगों का जो deposit है, you should always have that, so that whenever people need it, you should be able to give them that. And profitability is by loaning out, you can make some money. You have to make sure कि liquidity भी हो और profitability भी हो. Sometimes what happens is banks, for profitability, they overreach and they loan out too much. उसमें short term, medium term, long term सब हो सकते हैं. ठीक है? So the thing is कि commercial banks, whenever they need to borrow money, they can go to the central bank. सेंट्रल बैंक और कमर्शियल बैंक्स की बोरोइंग के बीच में जो रेट होता है उसको हम डिस्काउंट रेट कहते हैं. ओके, जस्ट द नेम काइबोर इज अ डिस्काउंट रेट. कमर्शियल बैंक्स पब्लिक से डील करती है और वो डिस्काउंट रेट पे काम नहीं करती है, वो इंटरेस्ट रेट पे काम करती है. इंटरेस्ट रेट इज बेसिकली डिस्काउंट रेट प्लस व्हाटएवर द कमर्शियल बैंक्स वांट टू कीप, एडिशनल 1%, 2%, 3%, व्हाटएवर दे वांट. ठीक है, तो दैट्स द डिफरेंस बिटवीन देम. ये जो है ये CR बेसिकली जो मैं लिख रहा हूँ, ये CR इज कैश रेशियो. ठीक है, so cash ratio is the amount of money that you keep in the wallet. The more you keep, the lesser money will be there in circulation. So discount rate हो गया, interest rate हो गया, which you can manipulate to affect the money supply. फिर certain rules and regulations हो सकते हैं जो commercial bank, central banks commercial पे रख सकते हैं, that you have to keep X amount of special reserves with us. X number of अरब रुपए आपके जो डिपॉजिट्स के हैं वो सेंट्रल बैंक के पास हमेशा एज सेफ कीपिंग होने चाहिए. ये एक एडिशनल रिजर्व रिक्वायरमेंट ये लोग रख सकते हैं थ्रू दीज रूल्स एंड रेगुलेशंस. So just to make sure कि banks के पास हमेशा liquidity रहे, they don't end up loaning out too much money कि कल को मसला हो सके. तो स्टेट बैंक थोड़ा अपने पास रखता है just to make sure कि you know what commercial banks कुछ जरूरत से ज्यादा लोन आउट तो नहीं कर रहे, तो वो for special cases they can do stuff like that. Finish as much as we can. All right, so we were talking about monetary policy, and we said that you can use the money supply and the interest rate to have certain impacts on your macro objectives. I'm not going to go into those. Money supply और interest rate को change करने के लिए we spoke about a few instruments. For example, we spoke about cash ratio या liquidity ratio को changes कर दोगे तो definitely money supply can change. We spoke about open market operations जिसमें buying and selling of bonds या financial assets के through you can make changes to this. We said stuff like discount rate जो central bank और commercial banks के बीच में होता है, interest rate जो commercial banks और firms और individuals के बीच में होता है. And then we even talked about a little bit of like special deposits जो central banks rules and regulations लेकर आ सकता है. Special deposits goes into the rules and regulations and how they can actually change those rules and regulations in order to have an impact on how much money supply there is in the economy. So these were factors through which you can have an effect on macroeconomic objectives. You have expansionary stance and you have a contractionary stance. Economy को grow करने के लिए और pull back करने के लिए. Anyhow. Then obviously we've already mentioned this also, that monetary policy is monetarists' first go-to policy if you have to, okay, over fiscal policy. But then, obviously, we say there are problems with these theories, or जो कि basically Keynesian talks about it, that there are limitations. The first limitation is about the effectiveness of the interest rate. Matlab, the Keynesian spoke about the liquidity trap. What was that liquidity trap? Let me show you through that graph. You had the LP curve, your liquidity preference curve, the demand for money curve, which said that after a particular amount of money in the society, if you further try to increase the money supply to reduce the interest rate, the policy can become ineffective because the interest rate may not change. ये सिर्फ केन्जियन के point of view से है, because monetarists का तो जब LP का भी ऐसा नहीं है तो then you know for them interest rate will go down. But according to the Keynesians, they say कि एक point के बाद you fall into the liquidity trap that no matter how much money supply you increase in the economy, firms and consumers will not borrow money to invest or buy any financial assets. They're just going to keep cash in hand. And so our monetary policy becomes bekar. It doesn't have any impact. The second limitations they have is about the time lag. They say there is a time lag involved. Time lag as to what? If you make changes to the interest rate, okay, let's say we want to increase the interest rate so that the households start consuming less, borrow less, and so even the firms. Problem is that maybe you increase the interest rate, but households cannot cut down on their expenditure instantly. They will need some time to recognize that interest rates have gone up. We have to adjust our consumption patterns. Some things they are spending on, they cannot cut down their expenditure on those things because it's important for them to do spending on those. And even from the firm's point of view, the firms, because of the higher interest rate, they cannot immediately start firing people because the cost of production has gone up and cut down on the output. It can't happen immediately. They need some time. So that's time lag. वैसे Keynesians के साथ भी मसला है और the same time lag the reason we're going to give for fiscal policy also. Number 3 we talk about is this intermediation. Intermediation का मतलब बैंक्स का काम था borrowers और lenders को meet कराना और उसके बदले में they would keep whatever amount they wanted to keep as the charge. And they saw this in China, and I mentioned it earlier also, that when 2008, the global economy was down, Chinese were investing heavily in their public corporations and infrastructure development, जिसकी वजह से people were getting employment, and they did massive infrastructure development. Interest rate को कम कर दिया था, money supply increase कर दिया था, firms were able to borrow money from the bank and just start building, almost like puri cities bana rahe the, and construction was happening and the economy was doing well. The world was going down, China was rising. It did not make sense during that time. But eventually, the banks, the Chinese government realized that ye is not working in our favor because the interest rate is low and there's a lot of massive borrowing and construction taking place. Now imagine I borrow money, I make a building, and now when I try to sell it, nobody's buying. Or some person has invested into buying those flats. He invested the money and he got that 2 crore ka flat, 3 crore rupees ka flat. And turns out he does not want to live in that. He has his own house. He's an investor. He's looking for rent, but there's nobody wanting to rent that apartment. What are you going to do? So ye ho jati hai bad investments. Chinese at one point realized that it's not working in our favor. The GDP is going up, people's incomes are rising, but there is no demand for the things that we're creating right now. So unfortunately, then they realized that this problem ki hal ye hai कि we should go for contractionary monetary policy. Money supply kam karo or interest rate ko badhao. The moment they started doing that, firms and consumers who were so dependent on this free money, sort of like easy money coming in through borrowing, they had no option but to find other parallel venues from which they could get that money. So they left the banks. They did not work with banks anymore. They did not borrow from the banks anymore. They started borrowing from parallel markets, which eventually capital market came into existence, where people who had money were willing to loan out to the other people and people went and borrowed from them. So basically, the bank of monetary policy ka jo role apply hona chahiye tha of constraining people from doing that, that did not happen because people moved on to the parallel capital market. तो इनकी जो मीडिएशन थी वो बिल्कुल ही disintermediation की तरफ चली गई. They had no role to play for some time till the markets found its corrections and all. Number 4, they say भाई monetary policy के अंदर जो है ना कुछ conflicting issues हैं, which create some conflicting objectives, and that's a problem. One conflicting objective they're talking about is किस तरह से money supply when you're making adjustments to money supply और जो public sector borrowing है, PSB, public sector borrowing. Public sector borrowing क्या होती है? When the government expenditure is more than the taxes that they have. So obviously उसकी वजह से जो public sector borrowing होती है. Now they're saying that if the government decides to increase expenditure, ठीक है, and undertake public sector borrowing, as a result, what happens is that they go and they try to find money. Now they can go to two places to get this money. They can go to the non-banking private sector, or they can go to the banking sector. What we studied about them is when you go to non-banking private sector and demand money, interest rate tends to go up. And that rising interest rates unfortunately discourages local consumers and businesses from borrowing and investing and consuming, and the overall aggregate demand starts to go down, and it doesn't work in their favor. But on the other hand, if they go to the banking sector, that causes the money supply to increase and interest rate to fall down. Now, unfortunately, the banks, the government does not have control over affecting both the interest rate and how much money is borrowed. So there is a conflict over here. कि कहाँ पे जाएंगे, कैसे borrow करेंगे, because the money supply is definitely, not दोनों policies, दोनों borrowing के अंदर there is difference, and उसकी वजह से दोनों का result completely different direction में चला जाएगा. In this one, you will actually have an expansion in the economy. In this one, you will actually have a contraction in the economy. So you have to be very careful as to government's point of view where they're borrowing it from. फिर उसके अलावा we even say कि exchange rate के साथ भी problem आ सकता है, ठीक है? Another one would be money supply का जो impact है exchange rate के ऊपर. For example, what we studied is central bank interest rate बढ़ाती है. क्यों? ताकि capital inflow आए. जब कैपिटल इनफ्लो आता है तो डिमांड फॉर करेंसी इज ग्रेटर देन सप्लाई फॉर करेंसी, लीडिंग टू अप्रिसिएशन ऑफ योर करेंसी और अप्रिसिएशन प्रेशर ऑफ योर करेंसी. अगर तुम फ्लोटिंग में होगे तो अप्रिशिएट हो जाएगी, ठीक है, और फिर अप्रिसिएशन से एक्सपोर्ट हर्ट हो सकता है, इंपोर्ट ज्यादा हो सकता है, डोमेस्टिक एम्प्लॉयमेंट, डोमेस्टिक फर्म्स कैन गेट अफेक्टेड नेगेटिवली. लेकिन अगर तुम फिक्स एक्सचेंज रेट सिस्टम पे हो तो ये अप्रिसिएशन रोकने के लिए यू हैव टू गो फॉर सेल ऑन करेंसी, और उस सेल ऑन करेंसी की वजह से मनी सप्लाई बढ़ जाएगा एंड इवेंचुअली इंटरेस्ट रेट पे डाउनवर्ड प्रेशर बनेगा, एंड इंटरेस्ट रेट माइट एक्चुअली स्टार्ट टू फॉल डाउन एज अ रिजल्ट ऑफ दैट. और फिर ये तो हमने इंटरेस्ट रेट बढ़ाया था टू सॉल्व आवर प्रॉब्लम, इवेंचुअली इट जस्ट लेड टू आवर इंटरेस्ट रेट गोइंग डाउन अगेन basically. So we see a conflict over here that the policies definitely, they have certain limitations also, they have conflicting issues over here. So that's one thing that you will have to do talk about.